Hello everyone and welcome to the IFST Spring Conference webinar series, The Appliance of Food Science. My name is Helen Munday. I am President of the Institute of Food Science and Technology. Throughout this series, we will be showcasing the very best in food science and, in particular, its application through the very latest in technologies. We will be celebrating the hugely positive contribution food science and technology makes in ensuring the food sector continues to deliver. These presentations were originally part of the programme for our spring conference, which has had to be cancelled due to the current COVID-19 crisis situation. We are very pleased to be able to still bring you these presentations via webinar every Wednesday throughout April into May. I would like to thank the Food and Drink Federation for kindly sponsoring this series of webinars. We would also like to thank our corporate sponsors, Marks & Spencer, Nutraceuticals Group, IFST and Camden BRI, who provide sponsorship throughout the year, which helps IFST to deliver many of its charitable activities. I hope you enjoy this webinar and would encourage you to register for other webinars in the series. With that, I hand over to Natasha Medhurst, IFST Scientific Affairs Manager.
Thank you, Helen. Our speaker today is Mark Driscoll. Mark is the founder of Tasting the Future, a not-for-profit sustainable food systems consultancy, and sits on a number of advisory boards. He has over 30 years' experience working on solutions to address some of the key social and environmental challenges confronting our global food system. For more information on his biography, please look on our website. So, without further ado, I will hand over to you, Mark.
Thank you for this introduction, Natasha, and hi there, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be presenting at this webinar today. I hope you're all keeping well and healthy during what is a very strange and difficult time for many of us with regards to the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. The focus of my presentation is what the food sector can and should be doing to shift towards more sustainable, healthy diets. Essentially, diets that are good for our health and the health of our planet. I will outline what I mean by sustainable nutrition and diets, look at some of the key trends impacting on food, explore innovations around sustainable diets, and outline what the food sector could be doing to mainstream sustainable diets in practice. And of course, I shall be exploring the business case for this. I have to say that during the last few years, we have witnessed a real surge in interest in sustainable diets, with a revolution, for example, in plant-based eating, really turning from a trend to the mainstream, which I think will continue to accelerate as we enter a new decade. Forecast growth of plant-based protein and meat alternatives is projected to increase from some $4.6 billion back in 2018 to a whopping $85 billion in 2030, according to one investment firm. Price continues to be the main determinant of consumer choice. However, an increasing number of consumers and investors are concerned and motivated to make buying and investment decisions increasingly based on health, sustainability, and animal welfare impacts, alongside price, of course. This presents huge opportunities for the food sector, and clear sustainability and procurement strategies, embedded right across the business, are now seen as essential in terms of a business's license to operate. Last year, we witnessed a plethora of reports focusing on the impact of food on human and planetary health, more than actually have ever seen in previous years. There was the famous or infamous Eat Lancet report, which was launched in January 2019. It highlighted that changing our current diets to the reference diet is key to living within planetary limits and could avert some 11 million deaths a year. Then we had a landmark UN report on biodiversity and ecosystem services back in May, which found that human activities, particularly our food system, is putting millions of species at risk, and that we are already in the midst of the 6th greatest mass extinction the planet has ever seen. This was followed in August last year by the IPCC report on climate and land, which highlighted how our diets are one of the most significant drivers of increased GHG emissions, with our food system contributing up to 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions if you include drivers such as land use change. More recently, coronavirus has put our food system in the spotlight, both as a vector of zoonotic diseases, those diseases such as COVID-19 or SARS, which emerge from wild animal populations, but also in terms of the ability of our food system to resist future shocks. In terms of the sustainability challenge, we only obviously have one planet. And yet, if the 7.8 billion people who currently live on our planet today consumed as much resources as the average person in Western Europe does, we would actually need over 3 planets. We are using our resources much faster than they can be replenished. Our food system is perhaps one of the most significant drivers of climate change, water extraction, and biodiversity loss. It also dominates land use on planet Earth. Today, the world population uses approximately 50% of total habitable land for agriculture. 77% of this land is used to raise animals, which supplies 17% of our calories, and 23% of this land is used to grow crops for human consumption, supplying the remaining 83% of our calories. Producing more food for a growing population, forecast according to the UN to reach some 9.8 billion by 2050, whilst reducing our impact, is one of humankind's biggest challenges of the 21st century. In the light of the current COVID-19 pandemic, the resilience of our food systems and food security are surely likely to be more prominent issues for decades to come. In terms of the human and nutrition challenge, we have 815 million people going hungry, a further 2 billion people lacking key micronutrients, and 2 billion adults who are either overweight or obese. The world is certainly not on track to meet the global nutrition targets, despite the fact that we are in the middle of the so-called Decade for Action on Nutrition. In the UK, some 30% of us are overweight, another 30% of us are obese, yet despite eating all this extra food, we are still not really well nourished. The regular National Diet and Nutrition surveys show that the UK population continues to consume too much saturated fats and not enough fruit, vegetables and fibres. It shows that we are not getting enough of the minerals such as iron and vitamins including folates, vitamin Ds, vitamin As. We should, for example, be getting 30 grams of our fibre from our daily food, but are actually getting only just over half of that. Our diet really does need an overhaul, both for the sake of our health and for the sake of our planet. I just want us to focus a little bit on this concept of what I call sustainable nutrition, as indicated in this slide. I actually believe that in order to address the twin health and sustainability challenges, food businesses, whether we are farmers, manufacturers, retailers, food services, and other organisations working in the food system, really need to focus on strategies which focus on what I would call sustainable nutrition outcomes. So focusing on actions which can improve both planetary and human health, not one or the other, but both. Sustainable nutrition is, I believe, a concept that can help food businesses align often conflicting internal strategies and provide a lens for cross-sectorial collaboration to resolve some of the challenges I've just outlined. No one organisation can tackle some of the challenges on their own. From my experience, the biggest barrier to any organisation creating external change, collaborating externally, is some of those internal barriers. A lack of leadership, a lack of vision, or internal strategies that often don't align. The numbers of times I've seen businesses with what on the surface look like good and great CSR strategies, but actually many of them still fail to deliver in practice because, for example, procurement teams, new product development teams, brands or marketing teams are not aligned or incentivized to deliver. How many times have I seen some brilliant and great targets, but actually if procurement teams aren't motivated or incentivized to make buying decisions, not just based on price, but on the sustainability, nutrition and health of the products they're purchasing, then of course sustainability and health will always come second to price. Sustainable nutrition is a concept which describes the overlap between sustainable food production and consumption, bringing thinking and action on both areas, changing the way we grow food and a move towards sustainable, healthy diets. We need to produce food sustainably, moving towards more what I would call regenerative production approaches, so that businesses restore those ecosystems, improve livelihoods on which they depend, and at the same time producing healthy and nutritious foods which improve human and animal health. We could, for example, produce lots of foods sustainably, but if they're full of empty calories or have negative impacts on our health, then we do have to question the production of these. Likewise, we could produce lots of fresh fruits, vegetables, whole grains, but if they're not grown sustainably, so if they use lots of pesticides, fertilizers, or continue to degrade or destroy ecosystems and wildlife habitats, for example, then they're not good for our planet either. We won't achieve the outcomes we are seeking unless we align health, nutrition, and sustainability strategies. As this slide also shows, sustainable diets are key to delivering a number of their global international commitments that governments have signed up to across the world, on the whole, with one or two exceptions, to improve human and planetary health. These include the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the ambitions under the Paris Climate Agreement to reduce emissions below 1.5 degrees Celsius, and the Decade of Action on Nutrition, which obviously aims to significantly reduce malnutrition and hunger. Pressure to transform the way we grow and consume food is only going to increase. We are seeing this pressure from a number of sources or stakeholder groups. I think there'll be, over the next few years, increasing pressure from governments, who are obviously very busy with the COVID-19 crisis at the moment, but there will be increasing attention on resilience within our food system, where and how we source foods. I think governments will increasingly look at legislative changes to address declining natural capital. Obviously, they're looking at it from a health perspective. The UK government a couple of years ago introduced the sugar tax, for example. But I think governments with consumer pressure are increasingly going to be looking at legislation to mitigate the climatic change impacts of our food and agricultural system and really focus on what I would call public money for public goods. So already in the UK, we have a review of a potential integrated food and farming strategy. We have the agricultural bill. In Europe, there's CAP reform. All these mechanisms will really look at how we use public money, and there'll be an increasing focus on public money for public goods, so environmental services, better health and nutritional outcomes. I think for some manufacturers, there's increasing actually pressure from retail food service, who are demanding greater traceability, transparency, and improvements in standards, again with increasing pressure from, I think, their customers. We are seeing increasing citizen movements, so the youth movements, Greta Thunberg's climate strikes, Extinction Rebellion, placing increasing attention on health, sustainability, animal welfare concerns, which will continue to drive consumer purchasing decisions. And finally, I'm seeing increasing attention from many investors, public and private sector investors, looking at funding to reduce long-term financial and reputational risks. The current COVID-19 pandemic and I can't give a presentation without touching this, is already shining a light on the vulnerability of our just-in-time food system to shocks which could take hold at any time. The UK is only 52% self-sufficient in food, with just 23% of fresh fruit and vegetables eaten in Britain grown here. This is crazy. Consumers are now looking for more food that is made just down the road from within their own communities or within their neighbourhoods. We need more initiatives that support the next generation of British and local food makers and have to produce more of our own food, particularly those healthy and nutritious foods that are better for our own health and the health of our planet. We are facing a crisis on UK farms at the moment. Seasonal workers cannot now travel here from Europe and elsewhere. Some growers are chartering planes to get their experienced workers here. Even if some of this we manage here with increased supply of labour, there will still be a huge gap and a need for UK-based workers from April onward. We have to make farming more attractive for UK workers and the younger generation. The average age of a farmer here in the UK is now well over 60. Millions of people experience a drop in income because of illness, new childcare requirements, reduced working hours, or through basically losing their jobs. It's too early to fully understand the impact of the current crisis on household income and employment, but food banks are already reporting a surge in demand. 4 million households are now classed as food insecure, and governments will have to look at affordability and health and nutrition of foods as a key priority moving forward. I work a lot on future food trends, and those shown on this slide are a few I've highlighted which will impact and shape sustainable diets well into the future. I now want to touch on a few of these during the course of my presentation. Forward-looking food businesses, large and small, are investing and innovating hard to meet the rising consumer demand for sustainable and healthy diets and foods. In practice, encouraging sustainable diets will mean businesses should be focusing on 6 key priorities. 1. Encouraging citizens basically to consume more plant-based products. This, in my view, has the greatest potential to reduce human and planetary health impacts, particularly fresh fruit, vegetables, nuts, legumes, and whole grains. For food businesses, this includes increasing the availability of plant-based products with huge potential to cater for the needs of an expanding flexitarian market. 2, I would say it's the promotion of more diversity foods. We rely on 8 to 12 globally traded commodities, which have been the focus of the bulk of genetic research and innovation, to provide about 60 to 70% of our calorific needs. Crazy when there are over 70,000 edible species on the planet, including dozens of what I would call orphan or forgotten crops. The need to reduce ultra-processed foods high in sugars, saturated fats and salt, which impacts negatively on our health. Sugar makes up 13% of 4 to 10-year-olds and 14% of teenagers' daily calorific intake, respectively. The official recommendation is to limit sugar to no more than 5%. 4, support for regenerative agriculture. I'll come back to that. 5, shorter value chains, which encourage more localised forms of production and processing, creating actually more value for farmers and for local communities involved in the production, processing of foods. And lastly, but not least, significantly important, is reducing food waste with all the embedded global greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental impacts. 1/3 of all food grown globally is wasted somewhere across the food value chain. As mentioned, I think the single biggest step that will significantly reduce our environmental impact of the food that we eat and grow is to ensure that we consume more plant-based proteins within our diets. However, I do think businesses, and many are getting on this bandwagon, do need to be careful, as not all plants are equal. Some plant-based foods, which are high in sugars, fats and salts, may not be the best from a health perspective compared to whole grains, nuts, legumes, etc. I do question the health benefits of many, for example, plant-based burgers, which replicate the taste and texture of meats. they can be as high in saturated fats, sugars, and salts as many of their meat alternatives. This slide, I think, just illustrates my point and looks at the environmental impacts of plant-based milks, just taking one category here. Whilst the environmental impacts of plant-based milks are lower than that of dairy milk, they do vary in their own impacts. For example, if you look at the impact of almond milk production in this slide, it uses water in huge quantities. Almonds are more often than not grown in water-scarce areas, particularly in California. In California, that state uses 10% of all its freshwater use to grow almonds and is actually contributing to a devastating drought and a significant drop in the water table within that region. I think if you're a business investing in plant-based foods, do expect more attention on the sustainability, health and nutrition credentials of the ingredients you source, particularly in the next few years. The Waste Resources and Action Programme estimate we throw away some 6.6 million tonnes of household food waste a year in the UK, of which 70% could have been eaten. This has a value of about £19 billion a year, they estimate. Around 85% of this waste, by weight, is from households of food manufacturers. Fresh foods such as fruit and vegetables are particularly at risk of being wasted in the supply chain, mainly due to short shelf life, overproduction or labelling errors. Companies are working to further reduce food waste by looking for different ways to utilise some of the food supply that might not be ready for prime time. So, for example, in this slide I highlight ugly produce that is now available to consumers through home delivery options or through the retail sector. Asda has a great wonky veg box scheme, for example. There are some exciting developments in packaging innovation. Nanoparticles are being incorporated into packaging to make food more valuable by extending shelf life. Lots of innovations around plastic alternatives. There is zero carbon cold chain technology being developed to get fresh produce to market more quickly, particularly valuable in hotter climates where fresh produce tends to perish more quickly. I think regenerative agricultural approaches are going to be an increasingly important part of the sustainable diet story. Those approaches that improve soil health, biodiversity, store carbon, improve nutrition, improve livelihoods are really receiving increased attention. I think it's no longer good enough now to reduce the impact of food, produce more food with less impact. We need to grow food that puts more back into our environment and society than it takes out. Organisations like General Mills, Danone, a lot of smaller organisations are investing heavily in regenerative agriculture. Many have been promoting more agroecological type approaches for years. These approaches use agricultural practices such as no-till farming, intercropping, the use of cover crops, precision inputs, biological rather than chemical fertilisers. There is also a renewed focus on soil health too, with the soil's ability to sequester huge quantities of carbon being the focus for the research community. In recent years, a number of businesses have recognised that there is increasing vulnerability and risk in sourcing of key ingredients within their supply chains, and opportunities to look at new ingredient sourcing of plant products, other products, driven by consumer interests in health and sustainability. One such example is, in this slide, Natrix's Ultimate Spirulina extract, which is 100% natural algae, which can be used to replace the artificial blue or green colourings in foodstuffs. Quite an unusual colouring in nature. As well as increasing interest in algae as a foodstuff, expect to see ingredients such as seaweeds, hemp, hef, and the water lentil making a comeback. Interestingly, the water lentil, as an example, which is also known as duckweed, and actually you often find it floating on your garden pond, is now being grown on massive aquafarms by companies such as Parable. They're a really interesting potential new future ingredient. Tasting slightly sweeter than normal lentils, they're highly nutritious and packed with omega-3 fatty acids, fibres and other micronutrients. They can actually double their biomass every 24 hours and can be harvested daily, so have the potential to provide large quantities of a healthy and sustainable form of protein. They're actually a high source of vitamin A, B vitamins, iron and calcium, and an excellent source of antioxidants. And actually, they have recently been found to contain a natural source of vitamin B12, a vitamin rarely found in plants. Whilst I don't have time to focus on the issue of personal nutrition in this webinar today, I think there is a lot of exciting developments in the field of personalised nutrition. So really this is kind of targeted nutritional advice, products, services tailored to individual health and value needs. I think there's been some really interesting recent scientific research, for example, which suggests that some foodstuffs have the potential to boost things like brain power, promote gut health, regulate mood, balance hormones, etc. And I think as individuals increasingly strive to improve their own performance in their personal and professional lives, increasing interest around health, there'll be an increasing interest around extracts, powders, food derivatives with health enhancing qualities, and also aligned with increasing interest around those sustainability attributes of those same products. One of the main strategies industry is using is to tap into the burgeoning plant-based market is through the expansion in the range of plant-based product offerings. Tesco has introduced a new range called Plant Chef and aims to have some 300 vegan products on offer over the next few years. There are a plethora of other companies coming into the market, backed by significant investment dollars. So, for example, the Spanish company Novo Meat has just revealed what it calls the most realistic fake steak on the market. It's actually made from pea, seaweed and beetroot juice in a way that creates fibres that replicate muscle tissues. Over the last 5 years or so, there's been some tenfold increase in the number of small and medium-sized enterprises established as mission-driven businesses with a focus on developing new and innovative business models to address the twin challenges of health and sustainability. There are lots of these I could have given as an example, just a couple here. One of these is Rubies in the Rubble, which aims to tackle a small part of the food that is wasted. They work with farms and collect fresh fruit and vegetables that would otherwise actually go to waste due to aesthetic imperfections or imbalances in the supply chain. They then turn these vegetables into condiments and now supply a range of supermarkets and delis, a great example of a mission-driven, sustainable business. Insects is another food area where we've seen an emergence of a number of small SMEs coming into the market. London-based Eat Grub, for example, deploys basically the environmental argument to win over shoppers who might balk at bugs for lunch. One of their best-selling products is actually marketed through Sainsbury's and is trumpeted as more sustainable than pork scratchings and what they say more exciting than a crisp. I do think insects will have a small market. I actually think the biggest market for insects is insects to animal feed rather than human food. A number of food businesses are now starting to explore what I would call orphan or forgotten crops. These comprise a multitude of species that are actually currently neglected or forgotten by major research, funding bodies, global food manufacturers and retailers. They actually include a variety of ancient cereals, grains, fruits, vegetables, roots, tubers. These include crops like millets, amaranth, pigeon peas, sorghum. All these species have long been overlooked, but interest is now growing amongst the food industry in their potential to contribute to food and nutritional security and improve livelihood options for subsistence farmers. I suppose today about 70% of our global food comes from about 12 plant and 5 animal species. Just 3, rice, maize, wheat, make up 60% of our total calorie input. And yet there are 70,000 or so edible plants or species that we can be used. Just one example of a business looking at these products. Last year, Knorr, part of Unilever Group, partnered with WWF to produce the Future 50 Foods Report, which identifies 50 foods we should eat more of to promote a sustainable global food system. This report now is being used as the basis for Unilever, Knorr, to develop a number of menu offerings using these products. There is, I don't think, any one silver bullet solution to shifting sustainable diets. To date, industry efforts to encourage more sustainable eating have largely been focused on giving consumers more choice and through back-of-the-package labelling. Despite these steps, I do believe more holistic approaches are needed that work in step with how consumers are making purchasing decisions. Purchases are typically based on habit rather than on any rational or informed decisions. Sustainable food attributes like price, taste, quality are often considered to be more important than sustainability in consumer purchasing decisions. I believe that the food industry will, moving ahead, need actually to place more focus on strategies that influence these factors. The World Resources Institute have undertaken some really interesting work in this space. As shown on this slide, they have developed a tool called the Shift Wheel, which identifies the need for businesses to consider what they outline as 4 complementary strategies. The first is the need to minimise disruption. This strategy really seeks to minimise the disruption to consumers' habits, including those such as taste, look, texture, smell, packaging, and the product's location within store, for example. The second is to ensure that there is a compelling benefit. This strategy identifies product attributes such as health and sustainability, those that will be motivating to the consumer to stimulate a behaviour change. The third is about optimizing awareness. The more consumers see or think of a product, the greater the chance they would consider purchasing it. Enhancing the availability and display of the more sustainable food choices and creating memorable advertising campaigns can increase a product's visibility and the chance that consumers will purchase it. And finally, what they call social norms, perhaps much more difficult to achieve. What people eat is highly influenced by their cultural environment and social norms. Shifting people so that they make purchasing decisions sustainable will, I think, require all sorts of financial incentives across the food value chain. So there will also be a need for governments to incentivise this change to help producers move towards a more sustainable footing. One example here is the importance of branding, marketing and research. And again, I use insights from the World Resources Institute. For several years now, Sainsbury's has offered its cafe customers what they call meat-free sausage and mash in a bid to provide more variety. Back in 2017, the company basically tested alternative names to see if sales would change. And actually, they did. They found that Cumberland Spice Veggie Sausage and Mash performed the best, increasing sales by an astounding 76%, as you can see in this graph in this slide. The Sainsbury's test is actually backed by results from other online trials undertaken by the Better Buying Lab. Across the board, so-called meat-free dishes have performed poorly, with virtually every other alternative name doing better. Looking at the global sustainability, health and nutrition challenges which we all confront in the future, there is, I believe, not just a strong business case for sustainable healthy diets, but an ethical and moral case too. How we all respond, how businesses, farmers, consumers, to these complex sustainability challenges, some of which have the potential to really threaten a company's license to operate, is becoming increasingly vital as we all, customers, shareholders and stakeholders, continue to pay closer attention to the need to produce and consume food that benefits both our health and the health of our planet. In summary, I suppose, in order for kind of the food sector to thrive well into the future, we and the food sector really need to continue to adapt and look at new and innovative ways to engage with our customer base and to mainstream sustainable and healthy diets. I like this quote from Albert Einstein: thinking outside the box, no matter how cliche, is oftentimes a necessary and extremely effective way to fix problems and come up with new ideas. Thank you for listening today, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for such an interesting and thought-provoking presentation. So we're now moving on to the question and answer session. So just a reminder, you can submit questions using the Q&A function, which should be at the bottom of your screen. So we do have a question. You mentioned quite a lot about plant-based diets, Mark. This is a question about the significant attention and debate about the role meat plays in sustainable, healthy diets. Do you think it has a role? And what strategies do you think food manufacturers should be taking to address the issue when it comes to product development, for instance?
Thanks, Natasha, for that question. It's a very good question. The short answer is yes, absolutely. Meat does have a role to play, I feel. There is obviously no doubt that eating more plants and reducing the amount of meat product consumption is better from a sustainability perspective. And obviously eating more fresh fruit, veg, whole grains, getting more fibre into diets is better from a health perspective. However, I think meat can still play an important role in sustainable and healthy diets. They just need to make up a smaller proportion of our dishes. I think there should be more focus on what I would call less but better meat. So when we do consume meats, think about where it is sourced, how it is reared. So more regenerative, extensive, pasture-based livestock systems that improve farmers' livelihoods, both in the UK and overseas. That obviously have their own sustainability benefits. So many of our uplands, many of our most biodiverse grasslands depend on those livestock systems. And I also think, obviously, we're very northern focused here. In many parts of the developing world, actually, livestock product consumption may need to increase, really, to meet the nutritional needs of the poorest. And I think in terms of product development, there's a lot that can be done in this space. I think in terms of plant-based product development, there needs to be more, and there is increasing focus on improving taste and texture of those plant-based alternatives. There is still some evidence. There was a recent survey, I've forgotten by which university earlier this year, of meat eaters, for example, that said, actually, you know, they get the need to eat more plants, but issues of taste, texture, perceptions of affordability, whether that's right or wrong, play into this space. So more, I think, improvements in terms of product innovation, developments in taste, texture, variety of alternatives are some of the key barriers to, for example, more plant-based alternatives to meat. And technological advances will continue to play into this space. Things like lab meat are obviously attracting a lot of investor dollars. I'm a little bit more skeptical that anything is going to be produced at scale really in the next 5 to 10 years, and there are still issues around the sustainability of feedstocks that feed those lab-based meats. So lots that can be done there.
Thanks, Mark. So moving on to the next question, it's regarding palm oil and whether it should be used as an ingredient from a health and sustainability perspective.
I get this question kind of all the time. I think it's an interesting debate. I think the debate was came into the media attention about 18 months, maybe 2 years ago, I think, following Iceland's decision to ban palm oil from its products. I don't think a ban on palm oil is the answer. And actually, from a sustainability perspective, it can lead to a whole bunch of other unintended consequences. So, consumers switch to other vegetable oils, coconut oils, sunflower oils, rapeseed oils, could have other unintended health and sustainability impacts without really a proper assessment of those kind of other alternative oils. And actually, compared to other sources of vegetable oil, palm oil production is an extremely efficient way of producing oils. I think yielding something like 5 times more oil compared to other crops. So it's a tricky one. If you're going to get palm oil, then do source it from the RSPO, the Roundtable for Responsible Palm Oil, the main certification body. It's not perfect, and it's come under a lot of criticisms over the last few years around failing to support smallholder palm oil producers, its impact on high carbon stocks, for example. However, they have improved their game. And of course, we should be looking at investing in potential alternatives that can complement palm oil, so algal-based and other vegetable-based oils, but again, really need to assess the sustainability, health, livelihood, and other impacts of those oils, for example.
That's clear. Thank you. So if barely 50% of food eaten in UK is produced here, how can we persuade consumers to buy locally when they expect foods like asparagus and strawberries to be available all year round?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I saw it in the Q&A panel. I think, first of all, that is a bit ridiculous. I think we need to, particularly following COVID, the issue of food security and resilience is going to come at us like a real steam train in the months to come. If you look at, within that figure, we only produce, I think it's about 23% of our temperate fresh fruit and veg, for example, which we can perfectly grow in the UK. Why are we importing 77% of our temperate fresh fruit and veg from overseas? We've underinvested in our horticultural industry. There's a whole question around the role of subsidies and investment in our horticultural sector. So I think a lot more can be done on that front, and there's consumer and citizen pressure to think about how governments and businesses can support that. Some great examples like Peas Please, run by the Food Foundation, that are really trying to focus on addressing that issue. But in terms of supporting consumers, I think, education is a really, really important part of the story. I think, particularly in the UK, in an increasingly urbanized society, we've become kind of disconnected from the growing, cooking, preparation of food. There's been a lack of focus on what I would call food literacy, and it's about re-educating all of us as citizens, as consumers, around the seasonality of food, the cultural value of food, celebration of food. But really, I think it's about education and understanding and literacy around which foods can be bought at which times of year. And you'll be amazed when some of the schools I go to, some kids don't even know, you know, how potatoes are grown, when they're harvested. So a lot more can be done on that front, I feel.
Thank you. So somebody from outside the UK is just asking about the sugar tax, so maybe you could just clarify what that is.
So a sugar tax was a levy on highly sugared beverage drinks. Oh gosh, I forgot when it came into the UK. It was about 2 or 3 years ago, maybe 3 years ago now. Quite surprised many of us at the time, really kind of to really tackle the overweight and the obesity crisis. So mainly levied on highly sugared soft beverage drinks as a way of providing a fiscal stimulus to moderate consumption of those highly sugary drinks. The UK is actually not the only example. This sugar tax has been levied in a number of countries. One of the first countries to do it was actually Mexico, for example. There are examples now of Chile focusing on taxation, restricting on marketing and advertising. Many developing countries are suffering from, you know, the double malnutrition and obesity crisis. So that's one mechanism out of many to tackle obesity and malnutrition.
Thank you. So another question also from overseas would be about advice for countries with less land for agriculture. And the example given would be Singapore. So where the tech companies, some of them you've mentioned, would they be how they get more attention from governments and the public to be able to progress?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And obviously not every country has enough land to be able to produce and grow all their own food. And you know, that shouldn't be the goal around resilience anyway. We're always going to import a proportion. I think technological innovation in countries like Singapore, I think there's a huge potential for vertical farms. There are some great initiatives in Singapore where they're regreening roofs, they're regreening the vertical sides of buildings. Really great way of engaging local communities living in a very urban setting where land is pressured there. So I think there are things that can be done through urban farms, urban gardening, community supported agriculture on the urban fringe, for example, where you know, informal markets in countries like Singapore play a really important and valuable role. But yes, I think you're always going to get, you know, a significant amount of imports from other parts of the world, and this is where, you know, global trade and tariffs, etc., that incentivize the import of healthy, nutritious foods is as important. And obviously, we haven't even covered the Brexit issue in this webinar and the implications that would have for healthy, sustainable diets.
That's true, we've not touched on that. But this is really a combination of two questions, I think, just to make best use of the time. So the question's looking for the future. So how do we join the dots between developers, producers, retailers and consumers to increase the amount of sustainable foods available for them? And then I'd like to add in the fact about in and out of the home, because people are concerned about whether out of home people are being as healthy, and how we would manage allergen issues potentially from new sources of food.
So yeah, so the out of home question is, yeah, an interesting one, because we all kind of let our guard down when we eat out of home. I think there will be increasing attention and focus on the role of food service sector in encouraging healthy, sustainable diets. I think the role of celebrity chefs within food service have a really important role to play in educating their customers, not just through their menu offering. Obviously, that's one way of doing that, but reconnecting their customers with where and how food is grown, kind of communicating and narrating that story. The Sustainable Restaurants Association, some of you may know, are doing some really great work with the eating out of home sector, and they have a sustainability standard, 3 levels, where they'll work through the food service sector, chefs, food service business to improve sustainability standards. In terms of coming together, collaboration is really, really important. I'm a huge advocate for the need for collaboration. I noticed many familiar names on the participant list. I've worked on collaborations from things like the Protein Challenge when I was at Forum for the Future, to pulling together collaborations at the moment through the Global Alliance for the Future of Food, to really think about how we can really scale up policy, practice new business models around sustainable, healthy balance. Many of you as businesses will face very similar challenges, and therefore you have to collaborate to overcome those challenges. And I think particularly a really big missing part of the jigsaw puzzle, I believe, that I constantly bang on about is the need for businesses to work more collaboratively together to get the ear of governments, to really shift government policy, taxation, fiscal policy, changing business models to support more sustainable, healthy foods. I'm not sure if I've covered those questions all in one there.
Did you touch on allergens?
Allergens, so I'm not a health expert, but yes, there's increasing focus on allergens within the food sector, and I think we're seeing increasing innovation in that space too. But I'm not an expert in allergens per se.
No problem at all. Fair enough. So price is obviously key to consumers' buying behaviour. What do you think about the incentives that are placed on or given to different agricultural sectors, and how do you think they could be changed to address new sustainability and health targets?
So yeah, price is a real issue. We're not really, to be honest, paying what I would call the true cost of food. We're paying for food almost 3 times over. The price of food we pay in the supermarket, through our taxation, through supporting often agricultural production systems that are supporting systems that are not necessarily producing healthy and nutritious foods, and we're obviously playing it in terms of the environmental and health costs, the cost of obesity, malnutrition, overweight in terms of our health system. So I think, again, governments do have to level the playing field. I think our agricultural subsidy system supports, heavily supports the livestock sector. We don't have a subsidy system that supports the horticulture sector, for example, and that doesn't apply a very level playing field. And so I think governments have a really, really important role to play in levelling that playing field. And as I mentioned earlier on in the presentation, I think there's an opportunity in the UK and elsewhere through the development of the food strategy for government to really take the price point more seriously.
So thinking more on the control from the food sector point of view, do you think there'll be an increased requirement for certification, and also any advice or insight into the marine sector, whether they've got regulatory norms?
So I think certification, I spent many years working with the World Wildlife Fund on a number of certification schemes in the past, and they do have a really, really important role to play. They're, I think, one tool in a multifunctional toolkit. So not all resources should be invested in certification schemes because they don't necessarily always address some of the systemic barriers and opportunities to healthy and sustainable diets. So things like the RSPO, the Marine Stewardship Council for sourcing sustainable fish, which we haven't even touched on really here. The role of aquaculture in healthy, sustainable diets is really, really important, particularly to provide protein. More, I think, for the developing need, where developing world, and there are now developing aquaculture stewardship council standards, and there are developing standards for a whole bunch of fresh fruit and vegetables. So everything from coconuts to sunflower oils are being developed. So an important tool, but not the only part of that toolkit.
So you've done really well to cover this vast topic in just about an hour, and the time is clicking on. So I'm just conscious of everyone's diaries. I don't want to cut you off, Mark, but we're just going to have to round it up. Unless there's a particular question you spotted on the Q&A, I was just going to turn to what would consider to be the last question. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I notice there's quite a lot on the Q&A, but I can always respond maybe as a follow-up to people as a follow-up to this call.
That's really kind. We would appreciate that. So the last one is personal to you. It's somebody asking what your favorite orphan food would be, and what does a good plate of food look like in your mind?
Oh gosh, so I quite like millets. So millets are grown in parts of Africa, Southeast Asia. They've got really, really long tap roots. They improve soil health. They're highly nutritious, full of vitamins, minerals, and yeah, they can provide real kind of a valuable source of healthy, nutritious foods for local communities, and more importantly, those local communities can benefit from those economically. The research and academic community have really underinvested in those kind of plants. In terms of food on plates, I think the more colour, I always go by colour on the plates. The more colour you can get on your plates, the better. Have mostly plant-based foods. Yes, seasonal, local foods. Make sure you eat everything on your plate. Have a glass of tap water next to your plate of food rather than any kind of fizzy drink, and foods with less sugars, fats. And celebrate provenance, culture, and make your plate or your bowl the center of your family, your community, culture, and celebrate provenance as part of that. And enjoy the taste. I think sustainable, healthy diets need to be really tasty, and actually taste is often, we often forget about it, but it's so fundamental to healthy and sustainable diets.
So a varied rainbow plate, really, that's enjoyable, tasty, and then ultimately empty.
You summarize it much better than I could.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you everyone for attending the webinar today. If we didn't manage to answer your questions, we'll try to do so afterwards. So you've got the opportunity to send those through on our email address, which is info@ifst.org, or via LinkedIn. A recording of the webinar, including this Q&A session, will be shared on IFST's website. And thank you again to everybody who's joined. And thank you especially to Mark.
Thank you.